Why are some women afraid of their own desires? This is a much deeper issue than one might think. It is not just a matter of morality, shame, or taboo. It is a suppressed cry of the soul. According to Carl Jung, man cannot reach true wholeness until he confronts his inner darkness. And for women, this darkness often begins in that silent zone where their desires are suppressed. For centuries, the control over the female body has been not only physical, but also spiritual. Desire has been discredited, defiled, repressed, but every repressed emotion turns into a shadow, as Jung called it. Repressed desires do not disappear. They retreat into the unconscious, change shape, become guilt, fear, alienation from their own body. The woman distances herself from herself by being afraid of desire. Her aversion to pleasure is actually a rejection of an aspect of her soul. Because desire is not only bodily, it is a creative and spiritual energy. To silence it is to silence the energy of life. This is not a shame, but a rupture of a woman's connection to herself, to her essence, to her intuition and inner strength. This video will explain where that connection is broken and how it can be re-established. Masturbation is not just an act here. It is a symbol of a woman's return to her inner home, of facing her own shadow and reconnecting with her soul. Because repressed pleasure is a repressed self, and it is precisely from that repressed place that healing begins. The discovery of one's own sexuality is one of the most repressed yet vital spiritual journeys of the modern age. This journey is not only the recognition of the body, but also the surfacing of what has been repressed in the depths of the soul. Carl Jung's concept of individuation comes into play here. One cannot reach a complete self without confronting one's own shadow, that is, the aspects of oneself that one has repressed and rejected. For women, this shadow is often covered by feelings of shame, guilt, and fear directed at their own body, desires, and capacity for pleasure. What society, religious codes, and patriarchal culture teach women is clear. Your desire is dangerous, and your body is an entity to be controlled. As these beliefs have been passed down through generations, women have become distanced not only from sexuality, but also from their own selves. Because the female body is not just a physical structure, it is also the basis of identity, belonging, and a sense of self-worth. The relationship a woman establishes with her own body directly affects her psychological integrity. A woman who is not at peace with her body cannot be at peace with her own existence. In this context, masturbation is not only a physical act, but also a kind of inner freedom for women. This space of freedom is a gateway to the self through pleasure. According to Jung, the process of individuation proceeds through the recognition and acceptance of one's inner parts. For women, this starts with recognizing their own desires, needs, and body without fear. Because every repressed desire is pushed into the unconscious and grows there in the form of a shadow. This repressed shadow returns in the form of depression, anxiety, self-alienation, and relationship problems. Women's sense of pleasure has been controlled throughout history, because pleasure is directly related to her power. A woman who feels pleasure becomes a woman who demands, who can say no, who can set limits. This is what the system fears the most. Therefore, women's right to pleasure is covered with labels such as sin, shame, wrong. The woman becomes ashamed of her own desires. She rejects herself. But true spiritual healing begins when you make peace with your own body and desires. There is a deep connection between pleasure and the self. A woman feels herself through pleasure. When she recognizes her desires, she better understands what she needs. This realization transforms not only her sexual life, but all her relationships, because she no longer acts according to the wishes of others, but according to her own inner compass. She can draw her own boundaries. She knows what to say yes or no to. This takes the woman out of passivity and makes her a subject. According to Jung's theory, the journey of individuation is not only a mental or intellectual process. It is a holistic process in which the soul meets the body and inner impulses and desires are also accepted. In this sense, female masturbation is one of the most concrete stops of individuation, because here the woman recognizes herself for herself, not for someone else. Touching herself with her own hands is actually touching her own soul. The resistance women face while going through this process is not only external, but also internal. Years of internalized shame, guilt, and sin cause women to distance themselves from their own bodies. However, the rejection of the body is also the rejection of a part of the soul. As a woman gets to know her own body, she realizes her own darkness, fears, and desires. This realization starts her transformation, because only that which is recognized can be transformed. Female sexuality is not only a bodily experience, but also the carrier of a historically repressed collective memory. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious manifests itself here in its deepest form. The alienation of woman from her own body and sense of pleasure is not just an individual repression. It is a legacy of silence, guilt, and shame passed down through generations. This legacy has worn different masks in every age, but has retained its essence. If a woman desires, she is dangerous. If a woman wants, she is uncontrollable. This is why the female experience of masturbation is not only a physical exploration, but also a silent revolution to confront this chained memory, to dissolve it and break the inner chains. When a woman's desire is repressed, it is not only the body that is repressed, the soul is also forgotten in the darkness. According to Jung, everything repressed turns into a shadow. A woman's repressed desire is not just an ignoring, it is a huge energy that accumulates in the shadow. And this energy, when not expressed, changes direction, self-hatred, insecurity in relationships, over-control, depression, even physical illness. This is why masturbation is taboo, because the individual is afraid of his or her own inner shadow. Because there lies not only pleasure, but all the repressed fragments of identity, silenced desires, and forgotten parts of the self. And when a woman steps into this shadow, the first feeling is often fear, but what follows is often freedom. Because to begin to recognize one's own body is to transcend the boundaries set by external authorities. This discovery runs parallel to Jung's process of individuation. The woman passes through her own body and reaches her own soul. The pleasure here is no longer just a bodily satisfaction, but an existential confirmation. The answer to the question, who am I, is found not only in the external world, but also in inner intuition, sensual awareness, and acceptance. At this point, masturbation is no longer a taboo, but a journey. A woman's first space of her own, an inner dialogue in which not only desire, but also shame, fear, compassion come to the surface. And in that dialogue, perhaps for the first time, the woman silences the external voices and hears her own inner voice. At that moment, not only a physical relief, but a spiritual awakening begins. Because, as Jung said, the human soul is not saved from the outside, it grows from the inside. The void left in the woman's soul by repressed desire turns into a silent alienation over time. At first, this rupture goes unnoticed, but then it becomes apparent when one enters into a relationship or when one wants to connect with someone wholeheartedly. Because a woman cannot establish a bond with someone else that she has not established with herself. A mind that remains alien to its desires, its fears, its body, cannot develop a true openness towards another. And so relationships remain on the surface. Emotions that appear to be love, passion, trust actually turn into artificial antidotes to close the gaps of repressed identity. According to Jung, the repressed parts of the psyche always express themselves somewhere. When a woman is afraid to recognize her own body, this fear does not only remain in her inner world, it becomes visible in her relationship with her partner. Lack of intimacy, reluctance to make contact, or on the contrary, overperforming in an effort to prove herself. They all stem from the same root, the feeling of not being enough. When a woman suppresses her sense of pleasure, her inner sense of inadequacy is also undermined. Because pleasure is not just a physical sensation, it is the soul saying, I deserve this. And when a woman cannot give this right to herself, she begins to expect it from others. The search for approval, the desire for constant acceptance, getting lost in the relationship or becoming dependent, Over time, the repressed sense of pleasure turns into a repressed sense of self. The woman is no longer just a wife, a mother, an employee. She becomes a spectator of her own life. This psychological structure that excludes her desires slowly pushes her away from herself. And the most painful thing is that she thinks this detachment is normal. Because repression turns into habit over time, and habit turns into identity. When he says, "I'm like this," he is in fact only repeating a lie told to himself. But the soul does not shut up. In Jung's words, what we repress eventually becomes our destiny. Even repressed pleasure will one day break out. It may be a crisis, a sudden feeling of emptiness, an unresolved relationship problem, inner burnout. Or it may quietly take shape, emotional distance, depression, even physical ailments. Because body and soul are connected, and every repressed emotion is somehow written on the body. This is why women's reconciliation with their own pleasure is not only an individual liberation, it is also a healing process. Facing her own desires is both an end and a beginning for her. The end of old thought patterns and the beginning of a new way of being. Because as the woman comes into contact with herself, she begins to move beyond external roles. She is no longer just someone's lover or a figure that fulfills the expectations of a society. She is now the bearer of a self of her own. And that self becomes stronger as it comes into contact with the sacred within itself. The sacredness of the feeling of pleasure comes into play here, because this feeling is not only sensual, but also spiritual. When a woman makes peace with her own body and desires, her connection with God deepens. Jung's journey of individuation comes close to completion here. The woman has both confronted her own shadow, and at the same time she has brought light out of that shadow. And that light now touches not only her, but also her surroundings, because a woman who touches herself also touches others with depth. This is why masturbation is not just an act. It is a symbol. It is a symbol of recognizing your own body, your desire, your limits and needs, of belonging to yourself first, not to someone else. And this sense of belonging grows from within, not from outside. The woman no longer needs anyone else to be complete, because she has discovered that she is complete within herself. And this discovery changes everything: relationships, love, loneliness, even faith. Maybe that's why most women are afraid of this journey. Because this journey requires confronting not only desires, but all repressed emotions, dark sides, denied selves. But that is precisely why this journey is sacred. Because there is not only pleasure, but freedom of the soul. Women's sexuality and pleasure have historically always been hidden, tabooed, and almost completely excluded. In society, women's sexuality has often been considered bad, shameful, or something to be controlled. These taboos have fostered deep cultural beliefs that guide women's experiences of pleasure and how they should approach these experiences. This has affected not only women's direct experiences of sexuality, but also their self-esteem, self-perception, and spiritual balance. As C.S. Lewis noted, one of the deepest human quests is the journey to find one's natural self. However, since women's pursuit of pleasure is often labeled as evil or forbidden, women have been prevented from discovering their inner selves by alienating themselves from this pursuit. The tabooization of pleasure leads to a deep oppression of women, not only physically, but also spiritually. Yet every human being must experience pleasure and fulfillment and make peace with it. This is part of their personal development and individual integrity. Women's right to pleasure has been limited by this taboo, which has become a social norm and is generally under the control of men. Many women have suppressed these feelings due to social pressures, feeling that the pursuit of pleasure is a source of guilt or shame. However, the psychological impact of these taboos is profound. When women feel that it is wrong to pursue pleasure, they encounter an obstacle in their journey of self-knowledge. Sexual pleasure is not only a physical experience, it is also a spiritual experience and helps to understand one's true self. When a woman's search for pleasure is blocked, a psychological conflict begins. She feels alienated in her body, in her desires, and in her inner strength. She cannot accept herself as a whole person because the connection between pleasure and the body is broken. This makes women feel sexually isolated, weak, or alone. The prohibition of pleasure creates a spiritual void, which in turn has profound psychological effects such as detachment, loss of identity, and self-alienation. Although the taboo that prevents women from seeking pleasure is the result of a social and cultural structure, it is possible for every woman to overcome this structure. Sexuality and pleasure can be a means for a woman to get closer to her authentic self. However, this requires the right process of inner exploration and liberation. When a woman learns to accept her own sense of pleasure, she begins to accept her own identity. This means liberation for a woman. When society prohibits a woman's pleasure, it negatively affects her mental health, self-esteem, and general psychological state. This inhibition is not only physical, but also psychological oppression. When women experience pleasure, it enables them to become freer, more self-confident, and more integrated individuals. Pleasure and sexuality can help a woman find her identity and accept herself in her most natural form. But this journey requires overcoming these taboos and rediscovering her inner strength. However, social norms and taboos are a major obstacle for women to explore their own bodies and desires. Pleasure and sexuality is one of the most important tools for a woman to fully recognize herself and accept her true self. However, this tool is often hidden and suppressed due to the pressures imposed on women by society. This suppression leaves women incomplete not only physically, but also spiritually and emotionally. Alienation from her body leads to a weakening of her sense of self. Limiting a woman's freedom regarding sexuality and pleasure disrupts her spiritual integrity. Pleasure is not only a physical sensation, but also a way for a woman to experience herself as a full and free individual. Suppression of the pursuit of pleasure leads to a woman's alienation from her inner strength and alienation from herself and her body. These repressions hinder the process of self-discovery, because only a woman who can freely experience her sexuality can achieve a sense of inner peace and self-confidence. Sexuality is an experience that allows a woman to be in complete harmony with both her body and her soul. However, in order to have this experience, women need to resist social pressures and overcome taboos. Only in this way can they accept themselves and their desires and rediscover their true selves with the inner freedom that this acceptance brings. When society makes women's sense of pleasure taboo, it actually negatively affects women's psychological health. When pleasure becomes taboo, women neglect their mental health and feel incomplete. When women explore their sexuality, they become integrated not only physically, but also emotionally and psychologically. This harmony between body and soul helps women find their identity and gives them self-confidence. Pleasure and sexuality allow a woman to accept herself in her natural state, and this acceptance leads to spiritual healing. It is therefore important to remember that a woman's relationship with her body is a process of spiritual integration, not just sexual. In recent years, many women are choosing to live alone. But what lies behind this? The fact that women choose to live alone is not only about individual preferences, but can also be seen as a social reaction. Women are tired of constantly living according to the expectations of others. They often have to put themselves and their desires on the back burner for others. In this way, however, a kind of inner emptiness develops. Women's preference for living alone is actually a reflection of their desire to embark on an inner journey, to rediscover themselves and to be liberated in this discovery. Women's attitudes towards sexuality and pleasure may differ from the traditional understandings imposed by society. We are in a time when pleasure is important primarily for themselves, not just for others. By relating to their own bodies and desires, women discover their inner strength. But this discovery is a kind of revolution. Instead of conforming to the norms of the outside world, women have the power to direct their lives by listening to their inner voices. This freedom allows women to fully explore not only their sexuality, but also their sense of self. For women, living alone is in a sense an opportunity to make this inner discovery. Focusing on one's own body, desires and emotions requires being away from the noise of the external world. This solitude is not a state of isolation, but rather a process of returning to oneself, finding inner strength and reshaping one's identity. This process shows that the pursuit of pleasure and gratification is not merely an external fulfillment, but an inner search for freedom and independence. When women break free from social pressures and taboos, they become more liberated not only in their sexuality, but in their whole lives. This liberation allows them to find their identity, accept themselves, and, most importantly, rediscover their inner strength. Pleasure is a turning point in women's inner journey. In the process of self-knowledge, a woman who establishes a relationship with her body accepts her own self, embraces her desires as a whole, and this is the beginning of her true liberation. Women's relationship with loneliness is often misunderstood. Living alone does not mean that a woman runs away from the world or gives up on life. In fact, loneliness is a woman's journey of refinding, discovering, and transforming herself. For women, this process can occur as a reaction to the pain of the past, the pressures and challenges of society. This loneliness is not only a physical condition, but also a form of spiritual renewal. When women are alone, they are freed from social roles and external expectations and find the strength within themselves. Women's preference to live alone is an indication of their ownership of their own lives and bodies. These preferences are a stance against external pressures, a desire for freedom. By standing against social norms, women begin to prioritize their own emotional and sexual needs more. Pleasure, at this point, is not only a feeling of pleasure, but also a way of rebirth, a way of returning to oneself. In choosing this path, women find inner peace by valuing their own bodies, emotions, and desires. This process of solitude is the basis for a woman to find her own identity and become free. The inner journey is an opportunity to leave behind the traumas of the past, societal pressures and external factors, and focus solely on her inner voice. In this process, women rediscover not only their sexual desires, but also their emotional and spiritual needs. Pleasure becomes a mediator in this journey, an experience that increases a woman's awareness of herself and strengthens her self-love and acceptance. Pleasure and solitude reinforce a woman's respect and love for herself, and offer her the opportunity to get to know her own body, its limits and desires. A woman's reconciliation with pleasure leads to a deeper understanding not only of herself, but also of the world around her. Harmony of body and mind leads to spiritual balance. Pleasure transforms a woman's relationship with her body, making her a freer and more conscious individual. This journey allows a woman's fear or shame of her body to be replaced by love and acceptance. She is no longer at peace with her body as a stranger, but as a whole. This peace improves her mental health and reinforces her inner freedom. Women's journey of self-discovery is much more than just a process of sexuality or the body. True self-knowledge requires confronting all aspects of oneself. It is not just a matter of conforming to external norms and living in accordance with the demands of society, but rather facing one's own inner reality, one's own desires, fears, and past. A woman's spiritual journey is about an inner self-discovery, rather than shaping her identity according to external factors alone. This journey involves confronting deep-seated traumas, lost emotions, and desires that have perhaps been repressed for years. Doing so goes beyond women simply getting to know their bodies. It allows them to know their soul, their being, their identity. However, there is an important point here. The relationship a woman establishes with her body directly affects her spiritual world. The body is a space in which women experience their self, express themselves, and reflect how they value themselves. Shaping this relationship is an important contribution to a woman's spiritual journey of self-discovery. For women, this journey often involves trying to build a strong foundation in their own inner world without being dependent on others. Because a woman's true power begins when she makes peace with her body and becomes one with her true self. This is not limited to a woman's pursuit of sexuality or external beauty. The source of true power and freedom lies in being self-aware, recognizing her desires and needs, facing her past, and making healthy choices about her future. When a woman finds balance in her inner world, she is stronger and more stable in the outer world. A woman needs to be guided by this inner journey, not only in her sexuality, but also in her whole life. Sexuality can be a means for a woman to understand her inner being, but this journey is not just about bodily experiences. Her body is a tool for her to be at peace with her identity. When she does so, she is liberated and reaches the true power of her potential. Acceptance of the body also means finding emotional and spiritual balance. This balance allows the woman to feel stronger and more whole. If you are really ready to discover your inner strength, you should no longer be influenced by outside voices. Sometimes, in order to get to know ourselves, we need to let go of the identities that society and others impose on us. Perhaps until now, you have been living with thoughts imposed on you without realizing it. But now is the time to embark on an inner journey. If you want to make peace with your body, your soul, and your identity, you must first turn to yourself. You have to exist with your true inner self, not just with what the outside world thinks about you. This journey is not easy, but the results are priceless. When you find the power within yourself, it is easier to overcome the taboos, fears, and obstacles of the outside world. This is your journey, and no one can take your place. Remember, to find your own power, to be truly liberated, you have to take this step. See you in the next video.